Hello, everyone. My name is Beryl Lifton. I will be hosting or presenting for today's Using FOIA workshop, an event to help you learn some FOIA basics and hopefully get you excited to start integrating public records requests into your activism, your journalism, your research, or just your daily lives as you continue to grow as members of this society. I do want to note that you will be able to offer questions in the Q&A box, and I will do my best to try to address them as appropriate as they come up. But if I don't happen to get to them as you ask, please just bump them again at the end, or feel free to get in touch with me afterward, and I would be happy to address them at a later time. And I would also like to thank Jewish Currents and the Tamiment Library for hosting this event. I love to talk about FOIA. I love to introduce people to FOIA. So I'm very honored that they asked me to come and share some of what I know with all of you. So, as I mentioned, I love FOIA. I love FOIA because it is a superpower designed for the people. And if you consider the long span of the human struggle for equality and justice in general, it is kind of amazing that we even have the ability and the right, really, to challenge our government and understand what it is that they are doing, and to demand that they present to us all of those records that are memorializing those policy decisions that they're making. A little bit about me before I get too far into FOIA. I filed my first FOIA public records request in Texas as a wee baby intern at an organization called Texans for Public Justice, where I was working on a report about the effectiveness of state tax credits for the movie industry. And I was able to get some numbers about how much, how many tax credits were being given out, and sort of the estimated economic benefits and returns of those credits. So my first public records request and my first encounter with a government agency being very upset that I used that information in a way that did not necessarily support their own policy initiatives. FOIA stands for Freedom of Information Act, but as you can hear, I'm pronouncing it FOIA. Some people will say FOIA. Takes a lot of time. You're free to use FOIA. Generally, it's used as a verb and also to reference a lot of the different state laws. But keep in mind, a lot of the different state laws aren't actually called Freedom of Information Acts. They have their own individual names, often Public Records Act or Open Records Act. And there are going to be some people out there who are going to call you out for referencing FOIA when it's actually a different state law. But that is such a minor issue. Everyone will know what you're talking about when you say FOIA. A few brief notes on the history of the Freedom of Information Act. Lyndon Johnson signed the United States Freedom of Information Act on July 4th, 1966. He was really resistant to do that. He ultimately did, after the law was passed, really championed by California Congressman John Moss, and also many others, including a young Donald Rumsfeld. And at that point, a lot of the same concerns that still affect the actual effectiveness of the law were already present. So concerns about national security, about access to personnel records, and just generally what it means when the public has some right to know what it is and why it is that the government is doing what it's doing. Since then, states have adopted similar laws. as I mentioned, they have different names and different specifics about the different exemptions that might apply and the different fee categories that might exist. But for the most part, they all operate under the same principles, and that is that this is a government by the people, for the people. It's our responsibility to be participating in it. And in order to do that in an effective and productive way, we are going to need to know exactly what it is that is informing our decision-making. We need to know the data and the information going into some of these policies. At this point, many other countries around the world have some kind of freedom of information law. And if you're interested in those, there are other resources available, including this link here that I've provided on the slide from the Global Investigative Journalists Network, which links out to country and continent-specific details on some of these laws. The Freedom of Information Act was updated multiple times in the past 50 odd years. And usually it is with the intent of improving the effectiveness of the law to actually varying degrees of success. Though the law has been in place for a very long time, it has been often difficult to use. So why would you want to use FOIA? Well, for civic engagement. There are plenty of reasons that individuals in their towns, in their states, and in terms of their national engagement would want to have answers to their questions. An anecdote that I will often cite as one of my favorites when it comes to FOIA is about an individual who had some road work that needed to be done in front of his home, and the city repeatedly had told him that they would do something about this sidewalk that needed to be fixed, but it didn't seem as though they were actually going to follow through with any of those plans. So what he did was ultimately file a public records request, and though he did not get those records, I have heard, what did happen is that the Public Works Department was outside of his house the next day fixing that sidewalk, because it can go a very long way to simply let the people who are acting as our government representatives, to simply let them know that you are paying attention and that you are going to follow up and that you are going to ask them about what it is that they plan to do. It's also incredibly important for research and reporting. So records can help to uncover and complicate and substantiate and disprove all sorts of things that our government representatives might tell us. And obviously, journalists are an important resource for the public for actually using, and it's important that they use FOIA. And then just general accountability. Also, I find it is a fine outlet, as you are, as many of you, I believe, are activists and researchers, a fine outlet for expressing some of your righteous indignation when it feels as though there is little that you can do in order to push improvements within your government. Filing a FOIA request and actually digging into what's going on can be very effective. If you like to get a letter, sometimes you'll get a letter from FOIA, and that can be a lot of fun. Getting any sort of update on your FOIA can be a real thrill, and people who get really into FOIA will can relate to the fact that it's a little like getting a present in the mail. And also, there are plenty of instances where this is a little silly, but when somebody's favorite celebrity or another well-known or beloved character individual passes away, filing a FOIA request for their FBI files or some of their other records seems like the natural first step, because unfortunately that person has passed away. But when that happens, they've lost their privacy rights. And so you can sort of see what the government might have been keeping on them. Okay. So who can file a FOIA request? Almost anyone. So there are individual states, Tennessee, Virginia, Delaware, Alabama, Arkansas, where there are residency requirements, and they are entitled to ask you for proof of residency when you file your request. In Louisiana, there is an age requirement, so you need to be at least 18 to expect to have your records request answered. And then some foreign governments have some limited access to FOIA as well. But in general, anyone can file a FOIA, and that is, again, because this is designed to support our individual efforts to participate in our democracy. So when would you file a FOIA request? When you have a question about what your government is doing, you might be curious. If you're a reporter, you might submit a public records request in response to breaking news. Some of you might be working on longer term investigations, and it can be very helpful to start submitting records requests then. And then whenever, honestly, there might be something of value to you in the government's filing cabinets. So, there's a whole world of records that agencies keep, whether that be the recordings on the subway. I have filed requests for the Department of Environmental Protection's shark videos. There are all sorts of things out there. And so if you think that it might be useful to you to know, to get access to some of the information that's already been gathered and paid for with your tax dollars, it's your right. File that FOIA. So if FOIA is such a great time, why aren't people just FOIAing just all the time? Well, because it can be kind of confusing, like gaslighting levels of confusing. Requesters sometimes don't know where to begin. They don't know who to ask. They're not really sure why, once they've submitted something, they haven't gotten a response or an acknowledgement, or if they get a denial, it can feel really bad and hopeless, and people aren't really sure where to go from there. So that keeps people from filing. I would like to note the law has generally been in place for half a century, but sometimes those delays and that confusion is by design, and so it can be really disheartening to engage with it. It can be incredibly slow. So here is a tweet from so-called FOIA terrorist Jason Leopold, who has filed many requests, works for BuzzFeed News, and just got back a response for a request he had submitted 10 years ago. There are some things that you can do to push back against some of these delays, but sometimes it just does take a very long time. So if you're a reporter on deadline, or you're an individual who, just has a busy life and can't really plan to be keeping track of something for more than a week, FOIA can feel like not the best option for you. Right now, a lot of federal FOIA offices are generally backlogged. They're understaffed. Again, this is sometimes a feature rather than a bug. And the federal average tends to be somewhere around 180 days, especially over the past year and a half. There have been incredible delays with FOIA responses, and you can really see the variation between different agencies and different agency FOIA offices. For example, the State Department, their FOIA office tends to be staffed by sort of retired Foreign Service agents. And so when the pandemic hit, their responses, basically stopped. Basically 97% of their workforce, they estimated, were in a very high risk group and weren't going to be able to do any sort of work. And so there can be a lot of variation in how agencies respond to your request, but in general, but often it can take a long time. There's also the fear of retribution, particularly for people who are trying to request records, perhaps from their local police department. There are concerns that once your name is out there as somebody who is going to be interested in the work that they are doing, there can be a fear that you will face intimidation, and this does happen, but I would encourage you not to let that deter you from filing the request. That is absolutely inappropriate on the part of your local government agency. But that is one reason that people have hesitated to file these requests. And generally, people have encountered frustration. So I've included a little clip here from the Electronic Frontier Foundation's FOIAs, where they sort of award and honor some of the worst responses that agencies have given. However, it is still very powerful. You can be very powerful, and I definitely encourage you to file a public records request if it seems as though it would be of use to you. Some basics. So for the most part, on the federal level and on all of the states, the law is applicable to the executive branch, but not necessarily to the legislative or the judicial branches. There tend to be mandated timeframes in which an agency must respond. However, that's not the case across the board. And so, for example, if you're operating in North Dakota or Montana, or even in Florida, which was one of the strongest sunshine laws, there isn't necessarily a 5-day, 10-day, 20-day window in which an agency has to acknowledge and provide you with a response. But for the most part, there are. There are specific exemptions usually outlined in each of the laws, and there are details about the requester status and different fees. So on the federal level and in some of the state laws, there are different fee categories into which individuals fall. There are commercial requesters, and by far historically, commercial requesters are the ones who most frequently use FOIA because they have the time, they have a strong financial interest, and they have the money to pay for the fees. And so they are required to do that. Commercial entities being private companies or anybody looking to use some of that information for business purposes. Then there are also media and academic requesters. They're entitled to a couple of hours of free search time and copies. And then all other requesters, which are people who don't fall into those first two categories, essentially. So this is not the case with all FOIA laws around the world, but in the United States and in each of our states, agencies are entitled to charge for search time and for the copies that they have to make. Usually it's somewhere in the 10 cent to 25 cent a page range. And generally they're supposed to be charging you a search time or a redaction time fee that is equivalent to the hourly wage of the lowest paid employee who could reasonably handle that work. Unfortunately, in a lot of situations, that lowest paid employee is still a lawyer, and their hourly fees can be outside of the price range of the casual FOIA requester. And then often these public records laws will include appeal options. Not all of them do, however, which is unfortunate. So where to begin? Consider what it is that you are trying to address. Consider what your goal is. Do not submit a request, for example, that is simply going to ask for all of the records that an agency has on a particular topic. Agencies do have some ability to deem your request burdensome or unreasonable. So if I were to submit a request, and I've seen people do this, if I were to submit a request to the FBI asking for all of their files, they're not going to fulfill that request. They might send you a response that says, we're not going to fulfill that request. They might just ignore it. Generally, the FBI's FOIA office is at least good about acknowledging requests, but for the most part, you want to refine the question that you have and think about in advance what your goal might be for that information. Do your background research, what additional specifics can you gather to help you frame your request? Or how can you help a FOIA officer locate those materials? How do you know that those materials even exist? Or are there already existing mechanisms by which the agency is supposed to report some of the information in which you are interested? Think about what your requester status might be, and consider where the best place to send your request is going to be. The office to which you generally will submit your request is going to be the office that is most likely to have your records. Officers, in a lot of cases, will help you to redirect your request if they determine that your request has been submitted to them erroneously, but they're not necessarily always going to do that. So it's important to sort of think about where your best options are going to be at the beginning. On the municipal level, sometimes agencies funnel all of their requests through the city clerk or through another centralized location. So just check the agency's website just check the agency's website for its preferred submission method. You can also generally file requests orally or in writing or electronically. I would not suggest that you submit your request orally because you obviously would want a written record of the fact that you submitted your request for later on when you might have to appeal or otherwise argue, or even just reference your request to another individual who might not have been the person who had initially received it. I would also like to note that FOIA only applies to government agencies, so you can't expect a response from a private entity. If I am interested in a vendor that works with a particular government agency, I cannot go to that vendor except in very specific states under very specific laws. I cannot go to that vendor and ask and reasonably expect that that vendor is going to provide me any of their information. There are some places, I'm thinking West Virginia in particular, where if an agency or a nonprofit receives some level of government funding, they do become subject to public records laws. But in general, that's not the case. And so limit your FOIA requests to government agencies. Those are the people who are actually subject to FOIA. You can request almost anything that happens to be a government record. I would call these sort of basic records because they are the ones that agencies are going to have a difficult time telling you that they don't actually have and that they can't actually release to you. So things like contracts and agreements of all sorts, invoices, any of the receipts that show where our taxpayer dollars went, those are going to be subject to public records laws. Reports and audits. Sometimes agencies will tell you that particular reports are not subject to FOIA or perhaps are in a draft form that could be withheld. But in general, these are going to be things that they're going to have to disclose to you. Grant and funding information and other policies and guiding documentation. And I would like to note that if you are interested in asking a police department for a particular policy and they are not willing to give you that policy, that is an incredible red flag. For the most part, that's disclosable information. And so I would be very, very suspicious if an agency tries to deny you something, for example, like a use of force policy or anything else that might be a bit controversial. It's just generally inappropriate, and agencies do it all the time, but it's an incredible red flag. You might also consider requesting bidding materials, so responses to requests for proposal and other sort of procurement documentation. Communications are fair game. I and you are absolutely entitled to ask for all of the mayor's emails and even text messages, letters, recorded phone calls. It is a little difficult sometimes if a government actor is using a private device or is texting a third party or vendor or somebody about government work, because there does have to be a reasonable process to go and get that information. And sometimes it's just sort of honor system that the government actor would actually provide the text messages to that particular vendor. But in general, those are public records. And so I would encourage you to fight for them. PowerPoints and other presentations, training materials, databases, and then note that you can request all of the documentation and other notes that were created while your request is being processed. So keep that in mind. If you get a response that you don't like, you can ask for all of the emails that were generated while creating that, while actually processing that request. Other records that might be worth requesting to varying levels, varying degrees of success, personnel and disciplinary records. In New York right now, I'm working with Gannett, New York on a statewide project related to police disciplinary records. In June 2020, the state legislature passed a law repealing Section 50A of the New York statutes, which had been used by a lot of police departments to prevent the release of disciplinary records, which can really provide insight into which of those cops on the force are bad actors and what their histories have been. We submitted requests to more than 400 different law enforcement agencies throughout New York State. And even after multiple follow-ups, phone calls, letters from lawyers, and appeals, we still haven't received proper responses from more than half of those police departments. And there are a lot of different court fights that are going on that have contributed to that. But there are some records that, while they're clearly publicly disclosable, agencies are going to fight their release. And then, things like other use of force reports. The FBI has something called special threat event assessments that they issue that you might be interested in. Video, anything sort of captured on behalf of the government, you could request. Because the worst that they could say is no or nothing at all. And in both of those cases, you generally have some ability to fight them on that. What would you include in a request? So while you could get on the phone and call a records office and simply tell them, I would like XYZ record, in general, I would recommend that you write it up, cite the law. And that is because, particularly if you're ultimately going to take it to court, you just want to make sure that you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's and cited the proper law so that they know that you weren't just a friendly person who was just happening to wonder about all of their police disciplinary records. You actually wanted it under their obligations to this state public records law. state your requester status if you have it. And on the federal level, you can request a fee waiver. So also consider whether or not you might want to do that. Do note, though, if you ask for a fee waiver or on the federal level, you could also ask for expedited processing. If you ask for either of these, do note that that kind of like kicks you off into a different queue, and that can slightly delay your request. In general, provide clear terms and descriptions for what you'd like to receive. So try to be as specific as you can, but not to the exclusion of other records that you might want if you're not specifically sure. So if there is a form that you know that they keep that tracks particular information, cite that form and know that they should have it, and you can leave your request at that. However, if you're not exactly sure how they might keep it, try to maybe leave a little wiggle room in your request and say that you might be interested in similar documentation or other documentation that might be sufficient to prove or to show X, Y, and Z thing. Remember that public records laws entitle you to records, but it doesn't entitle you to the answer to a question. So try to formulate your request, your question in the form of a record. Quick anecdote, when I was first requesting, I was very interested in private prison contracts, and I was submitting requests to Immigration and Customs Enforcement for their contracts related to all of the private prisons that I had seen listed on various private prison company websites. And I got a response back from ICE saying that they did not have a contract for this particular prison, which didn't make any sense because it was, holding people who had been detained by ICE. And it was very obvious public knowledge that there was a private prison operating in this particular town. So upon doing a little bit more research, I realized or learned that actually the private prison and ICE did not contract with one another. ICE contracted with the municipality through an intergovernmental services agreement, and the municipality contracted with the company. So ICE, not being particularly friendly, told me that they didn't have any contracts, but what they did have actually was an IGSA, and so that I needed to resubmit an additional request for that IGSA, which they should have known I meant when I asked for a contract, but because I did not very specifically point to it, they did not provide. So just keep in mind that there might be just a few additional words that you want to add to your request in order to capture any edge cases of which you might not be aware. Outline date parameters. So especially when you're requesting emails, agencies are going to consider it burdensome if you ask them, for example, for all of their records referencing, for example, cameras. Their inbox might go back 20 years, and they might have been talking about cameras in a lot of different contexts. And so let them know if you only are interested, for example, in a particular keyword term like body-worn camera or body camera. And if you're interested in a particular month, year, day, that's going to really improve your odds of getting a response, and also is going to help address any fee issues that might come up, because an agency is going to charge you a lot of money if they think that they have to download and redact thousands of emails. They're going to make you pay for it. In general, don't be coy. Give them clues. Tell them why you think it exists. Suggest who might have it. Send them news articles, point to their own records keeping schedules, provide to them whatever information can help them along in their file cabinet adventure. And then also remind them when you expect a response. Again, most of these states and the federal level do have response time requirements, and just let them know that that they have to get back to you within a week or two. In general, consider the bureaucrat. Your request is going to be passed around. The person who receives your request is probably not the person who created the record, probably not the person who filed the record. And so you want to keep in mind and be generous initially with the public records access officer. And also note that a lot of these agencies just love to get on the phone. It's a lot quicker than maybe playing email tag. And so if you are comfortable doing so, just call them and sort of walk them through what you're looking for. A few things to keep in mind. In general, just because part of a document is exempt, perhaps it has an individual's name or a social security number or other sensitive information, just because part of it is exempt, it does not mean that the entire document is exempt. And so ask for segregable information. If an agency just sends you back an entire page that is nothing but black bars, that is inappropriate and you should appeal that. Prepare your request to combat the rejection. So particularly if you're asking for materials that you know are going to be a little controversial, it could be worth it to either look at your local state public records ombudsman's website to see if that body has previously presented any opinions about this particular record, or to generally look through the law and see if there are any details that you can provide about how you know they're supposed to respond to this request. In particular, in New York, part of the law states that if an agency finds your request to be vague or burdensome, they do have some responsibility to help you recraft your request. And so it can be helpful to just note that in your request to begin with, so that if they proceed to not be helpful and you need to take this to the Committee on Open Government or another appeal board, you can at least say that you've done your due diligence and you were trying to work with the agency, and you also know that they were supposed to be trying to work with you. Agencies will nearly always release different materials in response to the same request. So even if you were asking for essentially the same contract from two different police agencies, it might be that one agency is going to give you the contract, the amendments, the exhibits, all of the communications that surrounded that agreement, and then another agency is just going to give you the contract and call it a day. So just keep in mind that it can be helpful to consider the other agencies that might have similar materials, because they are going to respond differently. You don't have to tell an agency why you are requesting the information that you are. Sometimes a curious local public records clerk is going to ask you genuinely out of a personal interest, but sometimes it's an intimidation game. And so if you're not comfortable explaining why you're requesting something, or you aren't interested in advocating for yourself, for example, as a journalist, for fee waiver purposes or fee category purposes, just keep in mind, you don't have to tell them. So don't if you don't want to. Be prepared to build your investigation. So, it might be that the question you're trying to address is going to require a couple of different public records requests. Maybe you want to submit an initial request just to understand who the players are in a particular conversation. And then maybe you want to submit another request to ask specifically for the emails of those individuals. And then maybe you want to build off of what you get from the response on that request. So just be prepared that it could be, it can be a long game to really dig down and get your answer. Private devices for a public business are fair game. So if a government official conducts public business on a private device or on a private email account or on their phone, even though that's not a public device, they were doing public business there, that is subject to public records laws. However, note that they cannot give you what they do not have. So if a government actor has deleted all of their emails, wiped their hard drive, the office handling your FOIA request simply cannot get to the information that you want, you can sue them, but it's hard to get things that they don't have. In general, follow through. One, assume good faith. Try not to get too worked up or paranoid right out of the gate. There are often very good reasons to become very suspicious of an agency response, but try to save that until you have have better reason for it. Ask for an estimated completion date. Agencies often will just keep pushing back when they expect they'll be able to respond to you, but you do have some right to get an estimate of when that date is going to be. Interview the response. So did they cite valid exemptions, or did they include the material that you expected? I've absolutely seen agencies cite exemptions that don't really exist for a long time before a lot of these responses could be placed publicly online and people could compare notes. Agencies were really able to just get away with saying, this statute says that you can't have these records, and people would sort of, sadly walk away. That is not sufficient. And so just double check that what they're telling you is true. Consider submitting a revised request. So for example, the FBI has a habit, if you do not cite very specific databases in which they, if you don't cite specific databases for them to search, they have a habit of simply going through their central records system. And then they will respond to you and say, we went through our CRS and we didn't find anything. So don't expect, though, that means that there actually aren't any records. Revise your request, go back and say, actually, I want you to search all of these different places, or consider putting date parameters around your request, or doing whatever might be necessary in order to improve that request, and then resubmit it. There really aren't limits on how many times you can submit a request. An agency can sort of deny you based on accusations of harassment, but unless you really are, it's hard, but that doesn't, it's kind of irrelevant. They'll claim harassment in a lot of different cases, but you can submit your request again. And then appeal. On the federal level, generally, if you appeal, you will almost always get additional materials. And this is because an agency has a long checklist, a long list of different records requests that they're trying to get off their plate. And so sometimes they will just send you whatever records seem to initially respond to your request. And actually, there are many others that they didn't pull for you, that they will need to pull for you upon appeal. The FOIA exemptions. So there are 9 federal FOIA exemptions, with a lot of others that are covered in other statutes. Generally, they cover national security, personnel, trade secrets, which is a particularly irritating one for me, inter or intra-agency communications related to deliberative process. This is a very fuzzy category, and its application has really expanded. So be on the lookout for that one. Personal privacy, the personal privacy exemption, exemptions related to law enforcement records and law enforcement techniques, financial institutions, and then B9, information related to geological information like wells. There are plenty of known barriers to getting your records requests answered. So agency resistance or carelessness, including a lack of technological savvy. We see this on the local level all of the time. Perhaps a particular records officer doesn't understand how to search an email account for what it is that you're looking for, or isn't sure how to pull particular information from different databases. So again, it can be helpful to just get on the phone and try to talk to either the records officer or to the IT department. Fees. Fees are what agencies' sort of favorite way to stonewall you. There are plenty of terrible stories about people requesting what should be relatively straightforward records and agencies getting back to them with fees in the hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousand dollar price range. So look out for that and think about how you might restructure your request to get around what they claim is going to be an insane workload. Agencies do have the right to destroy records on a sort of regular schedule based on their records retention schedule. So that can be a limitation to actually getting some of the information you would like. And then just generally poor records management can get in the way of getting your request answered. There are also these specific carve-outs, proprietary information. So agencies, particularly smaller agencies, but also bigger agencies that have close relationships with their vendors or their other tech partners will keep that information close. And then other sort of purposeful circumvention of the law. You should file a lawsuit after you've sort of taken all of the steps that you can in order to negotiate with the agency and then go through the available state ombudsman or state appeal board. So in New York, you can submit your appeal to the New York Committee on Open Government. And I just want to note, right, if you are requesting something from a New York agency, you would submit your appeal to New York Committee on Open Government. If you are requesting something, for example, in Massachusetts, from a town or the state, you would submit your appeal to the state level board. So submit your appeal to the proper office in the state where your request was filed. And New York Committee on Open Government, if you go to their website, has templates for you to use to appeal, which is very helpful. And they also have a lot of different advisory opinions talking about that they've issued in response to previous appeals. So you can learn a bit there about how they might respond and how they've previously ruled on some of these questions. Also, depending on your case and state, an attorney may be able to win attorney's fees. So once you've sort of done all of your due diligence, you've taken all of the steps that you can to try to work with the agency and then try to work through the state appeal board, take them to court if you can. It's obviously a bit pricier, but in states where attorneys can win attorney's fees, there are often people who are interested in taking up or at least exploring some of these cases. In New York, I've worked with an individual, Corey Morris, who recently began his own nonprofit to try to help fight some of these freedom of information law battles. And so just do a Google search if you think it might be worth connecting with a lawyer. And it might even be worth investigating who might be available as you're taking some of these initial negotiation and appeal steps. So there are plenty of places where you might want to use public records if you're researching companies working with government agencies. There are lots of materials related to the procurement process, related to the obligations that they have under the contract, related to how much the municipality or state is paying for this service, and then obviously communications and other training materials. Personnel records can be a bit difficult to get in a lot of areas, but public records can be a useful way of exploring where some of those known problems exist. Of course, if you want to do historical research, FOIA is a great route to take. If you perhaps are an activist, you might want to get records on yourself. Note, though, that individuals, as they live, have some right to privacy. So I cannot go out and request records on you without your permission. However, and if you were to request records on yourself, you would need to provide some proof that you are who you say you are. If you're interested in sort of understanding what the backroom chatter might be about a particular program or policy, communications can be very helpful. If there are programs in which you're interested, checking out what the grant materials or other funding materials might be, or looking at some of the memoranda related to the program can be enlightening. Requesters will use FOIA for genealogical purposes. And there are plenty of other reasons out there that you might use FOIA. So here are some other resources to sort of help you situate yourself in what might exist. Check out the state archive rules and also the record retention schedule and the subject matter listings for particular agencies. So usually every state will have some archival rules that they have to follow, and that can be a really good roadmap to help you understand what records agencies already have to keep and the terminology that they use to refer to those records. An agency's own website often will have a lot of information, so I would suggest that you do perhaps a site search, and you can search particular websites specifically for document type or for particular keywords, and that can turn up some useful starting points. Many federal agencies at this point have a FOIA reading room where they will post previously released materials, and they all also have to keep track of the FOIA requests that they receive and respond to in the form of FOIA logs. And a lot of municipalities at this point also will keep FOIA logs. It's usually just a spreadsheet that says this person requested this record on this date, and this is what we ultimately said to that person. Look at previously released or otherwise public records, and then also just take a look at different government statements about their policies and other public actions. You can usually use those to sort of help frame your request. If I am interested in Congressman XYZ, who said that this department is going to need to conduct this review, I can point to that and say, you guys were supposed to have conducted this review. Please let me see that review. Obviously, news articles have a lot of information. Press releases, if you're interested in different vendors, can be a good source of information. There are plenty of archives online. The Black Vault Document Cloud, which is a website that hosts PDFs for news organizations all around the country and all around the world. The Memory Hole 2, Government Attic, Reclaim the Records, which is specifically interested in genealogical records, and then Muckrock. I spent 7 years at Muckrock as their projects editor, and Muckrock has examples of thousands of public records requests submitted to agencies all across the country, and it posts publicly online so that you can see the back and forth between the agency and the requester and get a really good sense of how an agency might respond, and also see whether an agency has already released some of the materials that you might be interested in. Another great resource that I use all the time is the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press Open Government Guide. They have a very thorough breakdown of each of the state laws and specifics about the different records that you can get under each of them. So absolutely a lot of resources out there, and happy to hear any more that anybody might have at any point. Very glad that I was able to speak to all of you very quickly about some FOIA basics. This again is my contact information if you have any other questions about this, and I would be very glad to take any questions now that people might have. We are coming up on time, but I'm glad to stay and address things that have come up. All right, so I'm just going to take a quick look at the Q&A box. So something to note, somebody had asked, are there mechanisms to prevent government officials from altering or deleting records? It seems like because of FOIA, there's less of an incentive to preserve crucial records. So there are these archival rules already in place where agencies are supposed to be keeping a lot of this information for a particular time frame, usually at least a few months, but often a few years. And so those mechanisms are in place. They certainly are not supposed to be altering their records. And a thing about FOIA is that if you request something under a public records law and then the agency deletes a potentially responsive record, it's difficult to know that they've done that, but that's illegal. So FOIA in and of itself can be a mechanism to prevent government officials from deleting records. And part of why we had initially submitted the request in New York for all of the police disciplinary records was to try to put a pause on agencies attempting to delete records that they then would not want to delete. It's not a guarantee because the enforcement mechanisms around FOIA and FOIL are a little rough, but that is one way to do it. If an agency breaches the time limit for FOIA request responses, you can appeal. So you can appeal basically when they hit that mandated time frame. There's also a long appeal backlog, but if a federal agency hits that 20-day limit and you want to file that appeal, that's totally within your rights. You can call that a constructive denial. And if they continue to, and if an agency continues to say, we'll respond to you in a month, we'll respond to you in another month, that's also considered basically a constructive denial, and you can appeal that. Do they always have to tell you what the cost will be before they send it so that you can cancel it if it's too expensive? Yes. Okay. So I would note, I should have added that on the slide. Generally, you should maybe let them know what your cost limit is on the federal level. And generally, if you're filing a request through a portal, it will ask you what your upper bound is on that fee. Some agencies will be kind of nasty and say, we fulfilled this request, you now owe us $300. But if they did that, that means that they took all of that time out of their work days without guaranteeing that they were going to get paid for it. So that's pretty inappropriate. And so in general, yes, they do have to tell you, but you should ask them also to tell you in advance. Yeah. Do agencies tell people whose records you've requested that you have done so? Good question. Okay. Sometimes. And this is why I would suggest maybe asking a couple of different agencies. This will happen in particular when it comes to vendors. And this is because of this trade secrets exemption, where an agency, honestly or not, might not have a sense of whether a particular piece of information is proprietary information. And so they might consult with the company. They might also consult with another agency if the agency that actually created the record is not the agency from which you asked for the records. So they will sometimes tell people whose records you've requested. It's not entirely appropriate, but that does happen. So thank you for that question. How does one file a FOIA request for information about security clearances at the Department of Defense undertaken by the FBI in the 1960s? So I would go through the FBI. In general, with records that old, they've probably been acquisitioned by the National Archives. And so what would probably happen in this situation is you'll submit your request to the FBI. The FBI will do a little bit of work. Nicely, they will tell you, go ask NARA, here's the file number, and then you'll go to National Archives and ask them for that very specific file. I would say if you are interested in security clearances, I'm sure that there is sort of a box or a form where security clearances are kept. And so I don't know off the top of my head, but I would just do a little bit more digging to see if you can sort of narrow down how they might classify those, and then again, submit to the FBI. How do you know what information is out there that you can't access? Well, if that information that is out there that you can't access falls under the scope of your records request, you can generally push to have them explain to you what it is that they are withholding and why. So if that information is responsive but non-disclosable, an agency is supposed to tell you. Of course, necessarily, it's no guarantee, because we're dealing with sort of Schrodinger's information here, but that's going to, legally, that's how that process is supposed to work. How far back can a request go? For example, can an FBI request be for a person whose actions took place in the 1930s? Again, like that information often is already going to have been moved over to NARA. But an agency will tell you, or should tell you, if it does not have that information, and if that information was moved to a different area for archival purposes or was destroyed at some point. So yeah, it can kind of depend. And a lot of different agencies have sort of like consolidated or been dismantled in the last 100 years. But I would generally say that a request can go back about 50 years ish. And if they still don't have those records, have that conversation with them, try to understand what happened to the records if they don't have them. A request to the FBI resulted in a response, including this checkboxed response. Documents or information referred to other government agencies were not included in this release. Is this a full exemption via interagency communications or something to that effect? Or can this be appealed or explained? So I would have to take a look at the request, but what I anticipate happened here is that part of the responsive materials that they had originated or were created in coordination with another agency. And you should probably expect to be receiving additional materials because what they probably did was that they contacted that other agency and said, we are planning on releasing these materials, or we got this request, you have these materials, you need to respond to this request. So I would follow up with the FBI and then and clarify what that other agency was, and then follow up with that other agency, because sometimes agencies will get something on their desk, they'll be like, that's not my problem, that's NSA's problem, and then they'll pass it off to them, and then not actually explain to you that that's what happened, and then just sort of they rely on that agency to get in touch with you, but communication can be bad. So follow up with FBI, get some clarity. It's not necessarily I don't necessarily think that it has to be an exemption. I think that it's that this bucket of materials was not under their purview, and so they passed it off to the agency responsible. You mentioned you worked in Texas. What are the key similarities and differences between FOIA and the Texas Public Information Act? One of the most striking things about the Texas law, actually, is that in general, an agency is supposed to ask the Texas Attorney General for permission to withhold any information. So, and that can sometimes work in your benefit, because if the AG or the vendor, this sort of refers back to an earlier question, if the if either of those bodies don't respond within the appropriate time frame, then that municipal agency that received your request initially can release those materials. So sometimes if you're like looking for vendor information, you can get away with getting records that maybe a business wouldn't want you to have, just because they didn't actually respond to the email that they were supposed to, saying don't release those records. I'm doing some research about a politically engaged musician from the 60s. I would assume the FBI, oops. Oh, did I miss something? Am I doing this in reverse order? Okay, I'll start with this question. I would assume the FBI has some files, so I would place a request there, right? But how would I know what other agencies to approach? State agencies? Are there lists of other agencies we should know about or consider? Right. So again, probably the records have been passed over to NARA, but also I would take a look at which local and state agencies might have come into contact with that particular musician, because in general, municipal responses are going to happen much more quickly than federal responses. And so just try to sort of think of the map of all of the different law enforcement agencies or other types of agencies that may have intersected with that individual and request from them. they might not have anything. They might have passed things off to their state archives or deleted them by now, but that would be worthwhile. Do we have to ask for very specific records as opposed to asking, please send me this person's FBI files? In general, the FBI knows, particularly with some of the historical records, that you are interested in all of the files. So I would, I don't think that you necessarily have to ask for very specific records types. You can generally ask for their records and then just make sure that you include some of those other databases that you might want them to be looking at. Muckrock has a project. If you Google Muckrock subjects matter, there is a page of all sorts of FOIA requests that have been filed and responded to about different characters from history. And that is going to give you a really good jumping off point in terms of how you want to format that request and also the types of materials you might get back from that time period. How do you request info on individuals? I would like to request records on my grandparents who were among the founders of them and my parents who were active in the. Okay, so something to note, right? Request the information from whatever agency you think might have it and include an obituary or that DOJ 361 form. The FBI is going to ask you, and I should have noted this earlier, they're going to ask you for proof of death. They'll do that sometimes even with people that you know, everybody knows has already passed away. But that's what you're going to want to do with individuals, is just to either get that permission or provide some proof that that person has passed. I'm happy to stay on and answer all of these questions. Honestly, I don't know if that's annoying, but how do you request info? Okay, sorry. I'm looking for surveillance files on radicals, and I've been advised to specify when soliciting from the FBI whether the file would have been compiled by a field office or not, but I can't figure out how I would know this. Any ideas? I would suggest either take an educated guess, go, I would just Google FBI field offices. They've generally broken down into regions. If you're not really sure, just list all of the regions, honestly, and they'll have a conversation with you because yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes you're not going to know how the bureaucracy is organized and they can't expect that you would know that. So just try to get on the phone with them or push them to give you more information. Just help me understand how it is that you organize your records. I'm happy to work with you on this, but I'm not really sure where to start. FOIA office. Another use for FOIA is to request personal records that federal agencies have on you, right? Such as court records, records from EOIR, immigration court, or from USCIS. Yes, unfortunately, another use of FOIA is to request some of these personal records. This does contribute to the response times being long because for some reason, people who are working on immigration cases can only get from some agencies the required records that they need to handle their immigration process through a FOIA request through UCIS. And you can kind of tell my tone that this is very annoying. But yes, FOIA can also be used for these purposes. So thank you for bringing that up, Maddie. I'm interested in filing a FOIA request for internal records from a museum. The museum is a nonprofit tax-exempt organization which is financially supported by a mix of private and government funding. How can I find out if they're subject to FOIA? I would just double check the law. I would go to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, the open government guide for the state that museum is in, and see what they say about whether nonprofits are subject if they're receiving some government funding. If they are receiving some government funding and they're not actually subject under the state law, then I would go through the government agency that is giving them the funding and see what grant materials they have to provide. Because if they're getting grant materials and government funding, there have to be some deliverables or at least some level of accountability. If there isn't, that's a story too. Okay. I would like to request an FBI file on a deceased person who likely has a file. Is this a standard request that needs no further specificity. Again, I would just refer you to the subject matter project page on Muckrock. This is a pretty standard type of request, but again, all files and documentation from all of your databases on X, Y, and Z person who passed away on this date generally is a sufficient way to phrase that type of request. And then if you really want all the files, again, just appeal. Just say, I appeal the integrity of your search. Please try again. And generally that is a sufficient appeal. The response to a FOIA request submitted said the records are stored in the National Archives. I filed a request for the National Achievement Records over 7 months ago and received a response. Received a response or didn't receive a response? How do I proceed? In general, I would file an appeal. NARA is, oh, I see. In general, I would file an appeal, although NARA is not like technically responding to FOIA requests when they handle some of these. I mean, this is kind of a lame answer, but I would try to call them and see where they're at. I mean, a lot of these FOIA offices and a lot of offices in general are just backed up because of staffing and pandemic and all of this. It's a real drag. But yeah, that I think would definitely be the next step if you haven't already taken it. Do you have any experience with Oprah in New Jersey? I do. I'm not sure what you want to hear about Oprah in New Jersey, but yes. On the municipal level, stonewalled after requesting specific narrow data and agreed to pay crazy money for staff to compile info. What do we do in Massachusetts? Okay, no, I didn't personally file the FOIA, but I'm invested in this info being handed over to the community group reporter requesting it. Okay. Andrea, one, I'm generally based in Massachusetts. So if you want to get in touch with me, happy to sort of talk this out and hear more about it. You would generally file an appeal to the supervisor of public records. In New England, also, there's a great resource through the New England First Amendment Coalition that features a sort of public records hotline that connects to a law firm that can provide you some advice on specific public records issues. So those are sort of the two steps that I would suggest. But also, yes, feel free to email me and we can talk more about this Massachusetts issue. What if the records are digital and not paper? Public records laws apply to all of the records, digital, paper, audio. So it should all they should all be handled similarly. And the nice thing about digital records, right, is that there shouldn't be copy fees. So if they're trying to, we have seen agencies, I've seen agencies that have tried to, they'll print off emails and then redact them and then scan them and then print them off again and then mail them to you. It's crazy. But generally there shouldn't be all of those copy fees and other fees related to digital records like there are with paper records. Under federal law, are classified documents required to be declassified after a certain period of time? Yes, they are required to be declassified after about 25 years. Yes. You said police policy should be easy to get, but training materials are fuzzier. What is the difference between the two? As wouldn't they be training to the policy? So a policy, right, is sort of the basics of how the agency needs to handle a particular technology or approach. The training materials are sort of the specifics about it, right? So an agency might have a body camera policy, that talks about, how they have to upload their videos or how often they have to wear their cameras and details like that. And then the training is probably going to be specifically about like how you do that upload, how you place your camera, and provide some of those more specific details that the officers are actually going to receive and implement. I appreciate so many of you staying on because I'm happy to stay on and answer these questions. Would you be able to briefly recount any FOIA requests you've made, what the requests involved, and the context surrounding any of those requests? If we're counting FOIA requests as all public records requests, I've filed like probably, thousands and thousands. Generally, they're related to private entities that intersect with the government. So I'm very interested in public-private partnerships, particularly when it comes to prisons and policing. There are a lot of reasons and uses for those records. A lot of that work was done publicly on Muck Rock. So generally I'm interested in what the police are doing and the technology that they're using to do it, and then the ways that governments sort of outsource some of their activities to entities that aren't actually subject to FOIA. What can be done to address redacted documents? So I would note again the segregability factor. So don't let them just give you a whole black box. And in general, they have to cite a very specific exemption for each of those redactions. So if they did not do that, go back to them and tell them, I'm sorry, you didn't do enough work on this one. You're going to have to tell me exactly why you redacted each of these lines and appeal it. So I would do that first level appeal and then subsequent appeals after that. Unfortunately, it is just sort of like making your argument about why they need to take those black bars off. What is the best way to ask for emails and text messages? The actual best way is to provide the actual people who are involved and very specific domain or email addresses and a time frame. So all emails sent to and from @xyz.com to either this particular mayor or government official or to this particular email address. And that's going to be the best way to do it. Just try to get as specific as possible. What are your views on breaking up large requests into multiple smaller FOIAs? I think that is a great idea if you were able to do it, because agencies are going to be able to handle that much more easily. If you ask for a lot of records in a sort of a very broad way, they're going to drag their feet and kind of reasonably so, and they might have to go and consult with other agencies. And particularly if they do have to just sort of check with another agency, that's going to delay your response time. So if you can find ways to compartmentalize your questions in ways that they can easily digest, that is going to get you a response much more quickly. How do you know what info is out there that you can access? I think I tried to address this with the records retention schedules and the subject matter listings, but I would just go through whatever archival requirements an agency has in general, because again, that is what they have to keep regardless of whether or not I file the FOIA. So, and that is sort of their index. I would also just check out what their policies say, right? I mean, that can be a really good way to identify the types of reports or other internal reporting requirements there may be, so that you can simply just ask for those materials. Oh, and sorry, I don't know if I addressed this again, but old FBI records are stored at NARA, National Archives and Records Administration. What kind of non-text, non-document materials are FOIA-able? For example, video, audio, etc. Yeah, exactly. Video, audio. I mean, depending on the jurisdiction and on the police, on the state laws, body camera videos and those types of videos might be slightly more difficult to get, but generally those are supposed to be public. Just keep in mind that with videos, agencies will go through some level of redaction to personal privacy. So if there happen to be any bystanders or something like that, whose faces it wouldn't be appropriate to release, it takes a bit more time to redact video. And so that's going to cost maybe a little bit more. But in general, right, you can request video, audio, databases, really any other material that is government generated is going to be FOIA-able. Unfortunately, there's like a trend, right, where government agencies are keeping a lot of their information in private databases, right? So they subscribe to a particular vendor, and that vendor has a database, and the agency will claim that they can't actually get some of that information. That's kind of crap, honestly. So just be on the lookout for that. But we're working with an idea of record that is sort of a broad definition. I'm doing some research about a particular disabled school in New York City. How do I go about getting the records? Could you possibly assist? Yes, I can try. Email me. I would start obviously with the Department of Education, and maybe consider looking at the state level Department of Education and maybe the Department of Health and Human Services. But I'm happy to sort of talk about the particulars of that request. If I request personnel records on myself, do I create a public record if they respond to my FOIA request? In other words, is the FOIA response public? Yes, it is. So keep that in mind. Your public records request is a public record in and of itself. Someone else asked about getting records on a school. Are you familiar with using FOIA to obtain any pertinent information about public colleges and universities? I am. And public colleges and universities are subject to FOIA. You can't necessarily, well, some businesses have used FOIA to get, for example, a list of student emails, a gross way of using it. But yes, there's a lot of information that you can get about public colleges and universities, and I would encourage you to use FOIA for that purpose. If a school is getting government funding, student loans, and if one of their students is a BDS supporter and another person was asked to no longer go there as a customer, can I request a FOIA from the Department of Education as to how much funding this school gets? Yes, I believe so. In general, I'm not sure about in this particular context, but in general, at the very least, you can ask the government agency providing the funding to provide you with records about that funding. If the school is a private school, it's not subject to FOIA, so you might not be able to go that route. But if there's some overlap between a public entity and this private entity, then you can go through the public entity and perhaps get some information that way. How can one obtain police reports on a rogue officer in the community? He has a history of being abusive. Can he be placed in a database? I hope he can be placed in a database. I hope you get in touch with me and let me know which state he is in, because perhaps I know of people who are working on this issue there. And depending on the state law, you might be able to get some records on him. So that's definitely, and regarding police reports, yes, you should be able to get police reports in general, incident reports, anything like that, that aren't necessarily specific to the officer's personnel file, but do reference his interactions with the community. That's public record, or at least it should be. So yeah, please. Please file that request. And then I'm going to just drop here my contact information. Again is beryllipton1@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at _BLIP_. And I love to talk FOIA. So yeah, get in touch with your questions. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks again to Jewish Currents and the Tamiment Library for inviting me to speak to all of you. And I hope that you guys are all inspired to